Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Fatih from the Department of Economics at the University of Oklahoma, co-director of the Center for Peace and Development, and a senior researcher at the Security in Context Network. The Security in Context is an interdisciplinary research and pedagogy initiative that promotes critical research and policy analysis around key questions related to peace and conflict, political economy, development, and militarism. It is promoting new and critical global South-oriented thinking on the most urgent international issues and to promote North-South and South-South dialogue from a critical point of view. Now, the global South countries account for almost half of global manufacturers' exports and a significant chunk of financial outflows and investments. These trade and financial linkages are also coupled with massive infrastructural projects, security, and military cooperation among the global South countries. Multinational organizations such as the World Bank, IMF, World Trade Organization, and the United Nations are either reflecting the polarization of global divisions or themselves a site of struggle in the North-South interactions. Nevertheless, while South-South linkages have increased and transformed the global landscape, the global North countries continue to have a heavy military and economic footprint throughout the world, and they continue to dominate the leadership and power in international economic and political organizations and decision making. The goal of this research track and the database we are launching today is to grapple with a central question, which is what are the various consequences of these new modes of linkages on insecurity, peace, and conflict in the global South? In what ways do these linkages create new forms of insecurity, and how might they better serve the cause of equitable and sustainable peace and security building? What are the impacts of the blurring between South-South solidarity, global power competition, capital accumulation, and economic warfare in the global North and South? Now, why do we need an international organization leadership database? There are lots of databases about the rise of the South, the new multipolarity, great power competition, the decline of US and Western hegemony in favor of a more multipolar polar world. However, these discussions often lack empirical evidence. There are many axes of Western powers, such as financial, military, cultural, and so on. And this study and the database we are launching examines one axis of Western power, which is the representation on the governing boards of international organizations. And there are many questions that can come out of this also that we are hoping researchers can use. Now, a few words about the database before I pass it on to our guests. The International Organizations database contains data on the leadership of international organizations, such as national, gender, and educational background of the governing bodies and leaders. It covers over 200 different international organizations that are classified along different dimensions, including public, multi-governmental, civic, and so on. We used the selection criteria as the most prominent organizations around the world, and it includes a variety of information about their leaders. Now, few words about the results, what we see from a landscape of the analysis of the database itself. The multipolarity remains only in words. The percentage of American leaders, for example, has slightly declined over the recent decades, but have not much changed in favor of global South countries. Instead, the global North citizenship is a major predictor of leadership in these organizations. There's a significant path dependency in the nationality of the leaders in these organizations, and there's not much change in recent decades in favor of global South countries, including emerging South, especially given the changing dynamics of the global output and economic size of recent rising emerging South leaders such as China, India, and so on. Emerging South countries are disproportionately underrepresented given the size of their economies and populations in the world. The percentage of American educated leaders is declining over time, but not in favor of global South or non-Western leaders. On the contrary, Western institutions, especially the North American and British universities, continue to dominate the educational background of the leaders. The number of leaders who are women has increased in recent decades also in terms of the gender balance. The data will be available on the Arab Council for the Social Sciences Dataverse for free download. And in terms of the organization of our panel, we'll leave the last 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. So please use the Q&A window for any questions you have to our panelists. Now, I'd like to introduce our distinguished panelists now. Dr. Kevin Young is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and he has spearled the IO database from its infancy. Setenay Shami is the founding director General of the Arab Council for the Social Sciences. And I should mention that the Security in Context Network is an organic partnership and deep collaborative connections with the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, particularly the Beirut School of Critical Security Studies Working Group within the ACSS. The IO database is an example of a project that was rooted in the ACSS Beirut School of Critical Security Studies that has resulted in significant sub-projects and connections and partnerships with the Security in Context. Shamyam is an associate professor of political science at Temple University, and he's a senior fellow in the Middle East program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Leonard Seabrook is a professor of international political economy and economic sociology at the Copenhagen Business School. Thank you all for being here, and I'll, without further ado, leave the stage to Kevin.
Look, I found a stock PowerPoint beginning slide that's a nice video of people moving their hands about some documents, and there's been many hands in this project. I want to provide a basic walkthrough of this data set we're releasing. So in general, it comes out of discussions of how to measure multipolarity in the world. Today, do we measure states? Do we measure militaries, firms, capabilities? Do we measure network prominence? Sometimes the discussion of multipolarity lands in terms of leadership and who's leading the world. And there's many recent, totally inspiring pieces of scholarship lately looking at empirical analyses of leadership and elites. For example, within the IMF, there's all kinds of scholarship looking at the backgrounds of those that have led the IMF in terms of its different governing councils over time. There's also some amazing new data sets out there, the GPL and the TED data set that look at national leaders and trends in national political leadership over time. And there's other kinds of data sets that look at and are attempting to build new empirical studies of economic elites across countries. A lot of these are really, really useful for social scientists, and the latter two tend to focus on national elites in various forms. So for this project, as it were, we asked the question: what if we looked at the leadership of a variety of international organizations, or IOs? We took an expansive notion of IOs and collected information about the background of IO leaders over time, and we tried to center on the correct time configuration here, and we centered on 1997 to 2022 was generally where we could get information with pretty good fidelity. The current release today is going to have 186 different international organizations of varying different types. And we tried to follow some best practices within the literature, but also any guidance we could find in terms of existing lists of IOs. And so it amounts to around a little under 1,000 different people that are heading a variety of different kinds of international organizations, from multilateral ones to transnational kind of network-based governance, and a variety of different civil society organizations, which we include as IOs in this data set. And we collected basic information on the backgrounds of this population over time, related to their nationality, their gender presentation, and actually more detailed information about their education, which you'll see in a moment. So some of these IOs are just coming online over the course of the period between 1997 and 2022. And so for a lot of these organizations, they're not visible in the data going back to 1996, and others are. In other instances, we couldn't get reliable information using things like the Wayback Machine or annual reports to get reliable information, but it gathers up by the mid 2000s. So we have a very complex code book that describes all of the data underneath underneath the data set, as it were. This allows researchers to match names of IOs to other data sets, like the Huge et al. Study. Most of the variables are pretty self-explanatory, and I won't go over them now. In terms of the top line findings, I'm just going to describe in a very cursory way some of the top line findings descriptively just so far. There's a lot of Americans that lead that lead international organizations, broadly construed, over this period. They absolutely dominate the population here, and of course, anything like this can be looked at in terms of trends over time as well, as Frat was mentioning. The leadership of women has increased very, very markedly. So the panel on the right breaks things down into different what we've called IO types. So transnational IOs have had, in the late 1990s, barely any women leading them at all, and now they, as of 2022 anyways, they have the highest proportion of female leadership. And then the panel on the left is just the aggregate. Okay. We can also look at trends in education, and we have a variable in the data set just based on the number of degrees held by IO leaders and how that changes over time. There's a more modest increase. We can also use data like this to look at the flows between someone's nationality and where they're educated. And this, I think, is worthy of discussion and all kinds of future research. So if you can see my cursor here, on the left, we have the nationality of different IO leaders. This is grouping all years together, okay? So this pink rectangle here includes all the IO leaders that have French nationality. And most of them studied at universities in France to become IO leaders, okay? But a number of them went on, some of them studied in Belgium, as you can see by this thin little line over here. And some of them studied in UK, and some studied in the United States. What just a simple visualization like this helps to show is that the proportion of people of different nationalities is different than where people were educated. So if you look at the size, the United States rectangle over here, that's the proportion of the IO population from the United States, but many more people were educated in the United States. If you look at the United Kingdom, those educated in the United Kingdom over here, and those that have UK nationality over here, you know, it's about 3 times as many IO leaders were educated in the UK than come from the UK, as it were. And that speaks to a different kind of dimension of multipolarity other than just nationality, right? It speaks to where people were educated and the kind of ideas that they may pick up along the way as associated with universities and those different nationalities. This is another way of looking at the kind of correspondence between one's nationality and where one was educated. Big thanks to Ricardo Salas for helping me prepare this. This is a matrix which shows at the diagonal the percentage of IO leaders that were educated in their home country, as it were, okay? So 82% of British IO leaders were educated in Britain, okay? And so if you look at Japan, for example, only 60% of the Japanese IO leaders were educated in Japan. Another 30% of them were educated in the United States. When you look at the quadrant for how many Americans were educated in the United States, it's very, very high. It's 95% of the population of IO leaders that have American nationality were also educated in the United States. So that's just a different kind of descriptive overview. I'm going to show you 3 more fancy visualizations just to give you a sense of the kind of top line sort of bird's eye view descriptive properties that the data make available to us. So if we look at the educational backgrounds of IO leaders over time, and we think about it as a network, whereby every link in the network is between an IO type, whether it might be a multilateral organization, for example, and a specific university, let's say the University of Tokyo, okay? So in 2004, multilateral IOs had 2 people that were graduates of the University of Tokyo, okay? That's what's being represented in this network here. And also in 2004, maybe there's a transnational IOs had 1 person who was also a graduate from the University of Tokyo. This you can represent in terms of a network. So now I'm going to show you what things look like in terms of an evolution over time for a network with these kinds of basic properties, whereby the nodes are either types of IOs, either multilateral or transnational organizations or different kinds of civil society IOs, and different universities around the world. And I want to see if you can spot any interesting trends. There's a lot going on in this visualization, so feel free to draw your own conclusions. I just created this morning, so I don't have any fancy findings yet. So all kinds of properties that we could potentially extract from that in terms of the kinds of institutions that are in the hard core, how things change and evolve over time. But these data are just very easily taken from the IO database. Here's another way of visualizing, just stacking the number of degrees along a rank distribution of how frequently degrees appear in the data. There's a very, very strong prominence of Harvard in any distribution, any way you cut it, in the data. You probably saw Harvard very, very close to the center of that network, educating many IO leaders over time, and that didn't really change. That's been very, very persistent. Here's another visualization. This is the last one I'll leave you with. This visualization and its near cousin. So this is a representation. We have included a score of educational prestige based on a variety of different global league lists of scores of how prestigious different universities are around the world. And we've added them up and created a new kind of score. And what this is a representation of every university that's listed in things like U.S. News World Report, the Shanghai list of top universities, the ARWU ranking, et cetera, et cetera. And so every university on this visualization that looks kind of like a candlestick is a really, really good university. The best universities in terms of prestige ranking are at the top. Okay, and there's fewer of those than are at the very, very bottom that are listed but have essentially have a low ranking according to our new score. And the next slide, I'm going to show you what it looks like, what the visualization of great universities around the world looks like when we just look at the population of where IO leaders went to. It basically flips. It's a kind of a different kind of Rorschach visualization, but it's very, very top heavy. They tended to go to very elite schools, and very few of them went to schools that aren't mentioned or have very, very low scores. The x-axis, if you're wondering, is density. So it's basically a way of visualizing density. That's it for me. My ask for everyone is that you all use these data to advance knowledge and, of course, cite the data set and its associated documentation. So thanks very much for all the comments and feedback, and for security and context for setting all this up.
Thank you, Kevin. Setane, you're up next.
So thank you very much, Fırat, and thank you very much, Kevin. This is very exciting. I can, as an anthropologist myself, I can imagine all sorts of interesting questions that would come out of this kind of data. But before I go into that, I just want to say how pleased we are as the Arab Council for Social Sciences to be associated with this project and for our partnership in general with the Security in Context project. For those, I took a quick look at the participants, and I think many may not be familiar with our organization, so I'll just say a few words about that and then talk about our critical security studies project and how it intersects with this initiative. So the Arab Council for Social Sciences is a regional not-for-profit organization. We are headquartered in Beirut. We work across the Arab region, but we also have robust South-South and global projects as well. Our main interest is to promote and support the social sciences and humanities. And sorry. And we work with individuals and with universities and civil society organizations. We give out grants and fellowships. We have major convenings, a conference every 2 years, a research forum every 2 years. We also have a project which Fırat mentioned, which we call the Arab Social Science Monitor, which includes a dataverse. And so we aim to be a resource center for researchers in the Arab world and outside the Arab world, obviously. So our dataverse project, which will host this database that was just described to us, is a major initiative in trying to really increase or widen or deepen access to data, especially for regional researchers. And there is very little open access, open science initiatives in the Arab region, and we're pleased to be at the forefront of that kind of initiative. And we feel that trying to sort of encourage individuals and institutions to share data and to make data accessible is actually an advocacy sort of role that we would like to play. So even though there's very little Arab region data in this database and very little global science, which is obviously one of the points that's coming out of this, North-South inequalities in terms of access to research, but also will open up new research questions and new research agendas, working with security in context to disseminate the database at our convenings, for example, at but also to organize perhaps training workshops around these sets of issues that this database raises. So as I mentioned and as Fırat mentioned, we do have a working group called the Beirut School of Critical Security Studies, which is one of the older working groups. I should mention we're a very young organization. We're only 12 years old. It shares many individuals with the Security in Context project, and we do organize events together. And the working group has worked on several different types of topics, on war economies, on surveillance, on gender, on everyday security and insecurity. And I could see a sort of a branch of work or a stream of work on global governance also being added, perhaps, inspired and perhaps organized around this database. Now, Firat already mentioned, and Kevin mentioned, a number of types of analysis and trends that we can see in this database. And it was interesting to hear about the other projects that exist and the other databases that exist that look at global elites. Now, as I'm sure all of you know, there's a lot of work on national elites. There's always been a lot of work on elites and in the ways in which elites are formed, but also how they reproduce themselves. And so for me, one really interesting research question would be, how does this global elite reproduce itself? And I guess education is one aspect that you've already highlighted. But it would also be really interesting, although maybe daunting, to look at career paths and to look at how people move between organizations or not. So to what extent are these organizations also networked with one another through the mobility of individuals? There's been interesting work on US policymaking, for example, or policy research, showing how politicians circulate through think tanks and then back into government and then into universities, and Harvard being again sort of a central player here. So this kind of mobility and as well as career paths would be very, very interesting. And I was wondering, because just 2 days ago I was in a conversation about what's happening to international education at US universities. And it would be really interesting to know, although I think perhaps difficult to do, is how much international experience these people actually have before they get into international organizations, because there's a narrowing, there was kind of a flourishing of exchange programs and and exchange between different parts of the world and so on at a certain time. But there's a downward trend in that in US universities. And what's happening is more and more of these sort of study abroad or international experience kinds of programs are becoming very short. They're 2 weeks, 3 weeks long. They don't entail learning a different language. And it's part of the kind of flattening of the world in the sense that you can go anywhere and you can find a sort of American-style campus anywhere you go, and you spend a few weeks there, and that's your international experience. So very different from an earlier generation's experience, which had much more immersion and language learning and other sorts of integration into different contexts and so on. So I think, on the point about education, there's just so much to explore there. Again, as an anthropologist, I have to also wonder about marriage and family relations and generational sort of impacts and relationships that may also be working to create this kind of international elite. And finally, I would say, this is very timely for us sitting here in the region, watching what's happening in Palestine, the ineffective role that international organizations, including the UN, or primarily the UN, is playing in, the lack of impact or the lack of ability to impose sort of international law or to impose any sort of control over the actors. And so, it must be an exaggeration to think that we are a turning point of the world order imagined by these organizations, as imagined by global governance organizations. And so it is a little bit frightening, but interesting to think about where these structures these global governance structures are going. Okay, I think I've used up my time. And so I'll just end by saying that I think that this project has a very, very important sort of pedagogical and training component to it as well. And I hope to see that develop and evolve as we move along. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Setane. Up in next is Shan Yon. Floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Ferhat. Thanks everyone for having me here. I'm very happy to be a part of the Security and Context Network, having worked in the past and ongoing with Omar Dahi and other members. It's been a productive time for me and all of our colleagues, and critically rethinking and interrogating how issues of security and insecurity kind of reify themselves in the changing landscape of the international system. And it's in that context that I wanted to just give a few quick remarks about how interesting and innovative I think this data set is from the perspective of a political scientist and someone who, as a political scientist, primarily works with national case studies at the level of regimes and states, and deals with national leaderships and national political elites. But even from that aperture, I can appreciate, I think, the innovative nature of putting together as a way to tap the undercurrents of multipolarity, the organizational elite of multilateral and transnational institutions in the world. So as a comparative political scientist of the Middle East, I can attest that I've used personally, where I've referenced or used or even just I've heard of more than a dozen national elite political elite databases. Everything from Archegos to Parline to Lee to the newer GLP database that John Gehring and his colleagues have developed. There's a website called rulers.org. Even the CIA World Factbook technically is a data set of national political leaders. And one of the things I've noticed in working with these national elite or national leader data sets is that they tend to presume that the most relevant global elite will be those in positions of national authority, MPs and ministers and central bankers and kings and presidents and so forth. And obviously, while that to some extent is true, it also doesn't take into account the conceit of what we've long heard was the rallying cry of international liberalism and organizational advocacy, which is that multilateral institutions, NGOs, and regional organizations, transnational agencies, and so forth, not only leave a very powerful imprint on the global stage, but their own manpower, their own staffing also reflects or should reflect an authentic cross-section of the best and the brightest of the international educational and political community. And so I thought that in looking at the data and kind of test driving the data set for the first time some months ago, I was hoping that the trends I would see in the data would be very different than the trends that I see reproduced across virtually every national political elite data set. So my hopes were shattered in that the trends I saw largely reproduce the trends we political scientists see in national political elite databases, insofar that we see the prevalence of patriarchy, the network effects of certain prestigious institutions. We see considerable inequalities in terms of where elites come from and how they tower over, how they tower in their official titles over other elites. And we tend to see a clustering effect in that there tend to be a few very important countries overrepresented in terms of where people are educated or where they come from in terms of their representation as organizational leaders in these international organizations. That's not unlike what we see, particularly among the political elites of the global South. And so that's the other thing that struck me as extremely important. One of the great insights that we get from looking at global political elite data sets, and here I'm thinking about the GLP data set, which is the Global Leadership Project data set that John Gehring and his colleagues have developed. It's that the relative inequalities we see between elites and everyone else, and the reproduction of inequity, tends to be more pronounced in poor global South countries than in the West. So, for instance, elites in poor countries tend to be, for instance, more male-dominated. They tend to be much more likely to be educated abroad, and they tend to more likely come from a certain substratum of very prestigious selective institutions. So they tend to self-select, or they tend to appear more set apart from other people in their countries than, say, political elites in wealthier countries. So the reason I bring this up is that I see some of those patterns transposed in the organizational elite of these IOs. I mean, what I was hoping would be a more equitable cross-section of global talent in terms of who's capable of leading or advocating or activating or mobilizing for these IOs, who's capable of fulfilling important managerial, bureaucratic, administrative, or research tasks. Surely they would represent a fair cross-section of the world. I tend to see the gaping disparities I associate with elite patterns in global South countries. I actually see in these IOs. And the scary thing for me is that many of these IOs are based in, wealthier OECD countries, which I think invokes a question: how is it that these hierarchies reproduce themselves in ways that, where they're an even plainer view, these IOs operate under ostensibly some pretense of transparency, and they're supposed to draw from a much broader global audience. So how is it that they can be even more cloistered and more inequitable in their educational hierarchies than the wealthy countries themselves that they happen to be headquartered within, at least for many of them? For me, that's a damning puzzle that I'll think about for some time. And I'd like to hear what other people have to say about this, so I'll just end there. But with one final personal anecdote that's on my mind. So I mean, the network effects of these certain selective institutions are very pronounced, and I think we can all see that. And certain institutions are overrepresented, and I think it bears interrogating how those network effects actually inductively operate on the ground. I mean, I got my PhD from Harvard, and I remember in some of my classes, I mean, yeah, I could look. I mean, I only ever wanted to be a humble, underpaid academic my entire life. So I knew going to school there that my future was set. But I remember in many of my classes looking around my classmates thinking, okay, so this person wants to be the next president of the World Bank. This person wants to be the next head of crisis group. This person wants to be the next, humanitarian, aid, celebrity or whatnot. And I wonder if, what we're dealing with when we see the reproduction of educational networks, if it starts from a self-selection stage really early on, so that these schools are merely a conduit for elites passing through, or if these schools themselves are the generators and the transmogrifiers of these elite patterns, and they're the ones that actually reproduce themselves. Because again, from my personal kind of recollection, from my first year of graduate school, I could instantly pick out, I think, the people who I was going to class with, and I could probably guess are in some of these international organizational positions now. And they wanted to do that from the start. And for them, going to a prestigious, overpriced American Ivy League institution was just their way station to that goal. But certainly having the imprimatur of that degree certainly helped them enter into their networks, credential themselves and get past the gatekeepers of these organizations. So it's something that bears mention when we think about broader debates about multipolarity and the state of global education itself. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Sean. Leonard, you are next.
I'm very happy to be here. I mean, and the data set will be used by me and my colleagues here over in Copenhagen. And I'm very pleased to I mean, I have sort of had a chat with Kevin about this database a few months ago. And we sat in a cafe in Montreal, and we had like sort of an early draft of the cool animations in terms of the website animations, and the sort of, I mean, the excitement here is about having sort of a really impressive new data set on leadership, which I think we can do a lot with, and I work quite a lot with Kevin, so, and he knows how I think about these things. So, but I think I have thought through a few sort of key points that could be raised in terms of what this data set can be used for. So I've done a lot of work on the IMF and on consultancies now, and the big four accounting firms and similar. So this kind of work in terms of career analysis and networks and text-based analysis in terms of who was saying what. I've done quite a lot of that. Alexander Katikalenis and I have a book project which is nearly finished, which includes a database on the board members of the IMF. So I think I mean we can certainly add sort of I think we have 727 board members from the IMF in terms of their backgrounds and their career histories and their nationality and their gender and education and similar, and the basic trends you showed in terms of the sort of Harvard effect. I mean, I think that's probably similar, but not. I mean, a sort of Ivy League effect in the IMF board members. Anyway, I thought I'd put forward a few sort of ideas that we can sort of bounce around, because I know Kevin likes to spitball and workshop. So I thought, you know, sort of one sort of interesting proposition here, based on this database, would be to look at post-board careers. So I think, you know, sort of, I mean, sort of post-IO, I mean, what are the careers in terms of post-IO leadership? So I think you know, sort of based on you know, sort of an earlier idea here, you know, sort of again myself and Candy Kalenis, it's sort of an idea that we would expect to find from the IMF board, that if you've been a leader on the IMF board, your post-career, if you're from the global north, could be in the corporate world, and if you're from the global south, you go into public service. So that kind of a sort of basic proposition of what happens post-IO leadership, I mean, that kind of revolving door effect, and if it works for certain identities and doesn't work for other identities, will be something, you know, sort of to really kind of to test out. When it comes to sort of education and career histories, I mean, this is really sort of important, I think. And I mean, and I've been thinking about this quite a lot in work in the last decade, and also now. And I think I saw in the attendees, I think I saw Peter Haas. So, and I was thinking about Peter. You know, I mean, I haven't met Peter Haas before, but I'm a big fan of his work. I mean, the kind of theories that we would expect from Peter Haas and also from Ernie Haas. You know, sort of, I mean, in his book, When Knowledge is Power in 1990, about the sort of different behavior of IO leaders and linked to their staff and linked to their professional background and socialization. I mean, having those theories tested would be really, really great to do that. So, for example, one question that Alex and I have been thinking about is a question, for example, of, does it matter more for the IMF when you're trying to decide on matters in the board? Does it matter more that you're from a poorer country or a richer country, or does it matter more that you're a central banker? I mean, what identity trumps other identities in terms of sort of your preferences and how you articulate your, you know, sort of your sort of wants, desires within in leadership? So, I mean, having sort of an idea there in terms of, do certain kinds of backgrounds in terms of career backgrounds and sort of really sort of cement how people think about things. I mean, as IO leaders when in leadership. One other aspect, and this is number 3 now, that I thought about also that we could maybe have a look at with this data set, is that I mean, there was a book by Jane Fidel, had a book a few years ago called The Shadow Elite, and she had a concept in that book of the flexions. So, and I think that, I mean, this sort of idea that if you're a leader, you can't, it's simply not enough now to say that, you know, I'm an IO leader. So, I mean, you may have to say that that in terms of career history, in terms of your self-presentation, is that I am an IO leader, or have been an IO leader, and I'm also involved on the board of this corporation, and I'm also involved with this NGO and similar. So, I mean, I wonder if there is, in general, sort of a claim to being across networks. I mean, that kind of sort of, and that phenomenon, I think, certainly for the American leaders, I think we would expect to find that, and it would tell us a lot about public service as well, actually. I mean, and that kind of, I mean, in terms of sort of theories and sociology of networks, about whether actors are sort of a multivocal, a multi-positional. I mean, having that kind of data about sort of trying to understand how they seek to inform an audience about who they are and how they want the audience to see them is sort of also pretty interesting. The sort of last thing I thought about also, in terms of, I mean, on the data, I mean, having these sort of background data in terms of gender and nationality and education is really sort of important. And in the cases where you do have sort of quite extensive text as data on what these people think, they could be matched. So you could assign the IDs from the databases leaders to who was saying what and in what kind of meetings. I mean, and in terms of that kind of older trend of sociology on conversational analysis, I mean, having sort of a clear idea about who was taking turns with who and who was showing esteem to who and who regards who. And I mean, if they are clustering in a way where they are sort of all affirming each other in the same direction. I mean, having a link between the sort of gender, nationality, education backgrounds of these leaders linked to what they say and how they speak, and in what kind of turn-taking mechanism. I mean, all that stuff will be really, really interesting to explore. So, I mean, and that's my kind of initial thoughts on how it could be used in various ways, and that sort of cuts across political science and sociology. And I think that, I mean, it's all very exciting, and I will be an avid user. I'm happy to embarrass Peter Haas too much. I mean, I'm just wanting to say that I'm a real Haas head, a fan.
Thank you, Leonard. We have a couple of questions from the floor, but please feel free to jump in also to have an open conversation on this, both from the floor and also among our panelists. And some of the questions, I think, relate to some of the issues you raised as well, in terms of selection into these organizations, like to what extent it is self-selection, to what extent it is a power network, and also to what extent there is a revolving door type mechanisms between these institutions, right? Like you are head of ECB one day, you are head of IMF the other day, you are a treasury minister the other day, all three hats in one setting, right? And it occurs like one of the leaders, for example, for IMF right now. So one question is, who have more power in selecting IO positions, economic, political, or civil society power? The concept of social capital is very fruitful to understand this power trajectories. This is from Nuno. That's a good question. Do you have anything to add there, Kevin, and the rest of the folks here? Like, what factors do you think account for selection into these organizations? With one of my RAs, we quickly looked this week over some of the priors, like to see what could predict your likelihood of being selected. And we looked at this at the nationality level, not the individual level. And the question as an economist I had was, like, with all the debates over multipolarity and great power competition, and the recent survey that came out, a majority of Americans seeing China as a major rival, economic and political. And we wanted to see if income per capita predicts actually your likelihood of becoming the head of, like, or the percentage of leaders in these organizations. And surprisingly, no, it does not. So the conversation over, like, that IO scholars usually bring, that the post-war period setting of the global organizations from the Bretton Woods institutions to others were based on the economic factors of 1945, right? But we don't see that actually. So it's not economic power that predicts the percentage of nationality from a particular nation being the leaders. So what do you think is this is a research question, of course, but do you have any hunch feeling?
Well, I mean, in the IMF case, I think I have a pretty good understanding of what is happening in terms of the IMF. I mean, and that may be the same for different kinds of boards in the World Bank or in the OECD as well. I mean, there is I mean, I think the tendency is that, I mean, it's very interesting to us that I mean, if you're from a government which is more left and more socialist, and you're sending a board member to the IMF, you tend to send a neoliberal. So there is sort of an expectation of the kind of host environment for the IO. So I mean, intellectually there is sort of a sort of phenomena where more left-leaning governments will send more right-leaning economists to environments they think where they, I mean, that's based on the assumption that they won't have any say if they send a left-leaning economist. So I mean, I think the kind of that element of selection in terms of the kind of intellectual environment, I think is pretty interesting.
I'll just say that it seems like it's really, really different across different IOs and across different IO types. And I'm hungry for some kind of additional variable at the level of the IO that specifies like what kind of general selection procedure there is for a leader, right? There's like informal geopolitical norms for some IOs. Other ones, it's like transnational IOs. It's basically whether or not you've risen to the top of the national regulatory agency, or you're a scientific specialist in a given domain. And then in the civil society world, the big organizations in that respect, it appears to be some kind of mix often of being a super prominent individual, having had a robust professional career previously, and being attached to similar such organizations in the past, but it's probably pretty differentiated by IO. But that's it's cool to report your finding, Firat. That's really interesting. I mean, I don't know what I would have guessed either way. I think I would have guessed what you thought, but that's the awesome thing about data.
Definitely. Another question is, limited time, from Alamin, is about the structures and characteristics that the data set can provide about, what these leaders do in terms of cooperation and common challenges, like who the leader is. Does it have an influence in terms of the impact these organizations have? And I think that's a fascinating question too. Like, does the leadership matter in terms of steering, if I'm reading the question correctly, these organizations into some global, for example, public goods? Like, does the nationality matter in how World Bank or others address climate change challenges, right? That would be very interesting, I think, question. I think it would be exciting to look at, actually, if these organizations have an impact at all.
Yeah, I know we've talked about that for a few years now, right? Of like having some indicator of IO activity being potentially conditional on various characteristics of the leader. That remains to be produced. Maybe once we release this, other people will be motivated to create such an indicator. I mean, there is I guess a less critical or less skeptical take on the homogeneity of backgrounds here. There is a tradition in elite studies that suggests that people can cooperate and cohere as a community, whatever the direction may be, if they have similar backgrounds. That's a potentiality. That's a potential in the system of global governance. If they all have common experiences, they can communicate and some might say conspire more efficiently because of those common backgrounds, whereas things might be more fragmented otherwise. That's just a future research idea. We wouldn't know whether or not that's true or not.
That is true. I'm in the audience. That would be a great data set if you could map what the goals, targets of these organizations. But to be spoiler in the room, and what Krugman, I think, called the ketchup economists, that 32 Oz is just twice of 16, doesn't make any better or difference than you get a smaller ketchup bottle or a bigger ketchup bottle. So groupthink, I think, also could be a serious problem here. Two other questions from Peter Haas. One is about the universe of individuals from which we are sampling, and that the NGO community is huge. I think that's a good point. And also says mapping circulation of individuals between jobs would be interesting. That I think also is a very promising future research, like how they are moving among these various organizations. Like, right, because when we say Americans, we don't mean these are separate individuals, right? It could be the same American moving 1 year to the next from one organization to the next. So that could be actually very persistence of, like, we did not weight it, but would be very interesting to weight, like, for example, representation by whether it's the same individual or not. My feeling is that I think that would be a significant path dependency. But yeah, please go ahead, Leonard.
So on the actually sort of in terms of jobs being, jobs in careers in terms of how people circulate is, sort of something that we looked at CBS and on standard setting and sort of NGOs and IOs and corporations. But I mean I think the general finding there, and maybe of interest to Peter, is that the big contrast is not really according to nationality; it's between the length of the careers. And I mean, so if you're older, if you're sort of 40 years plus in our study in 2016, you tend not to move around, and you tend to be sort of more of a public servant or working for an NGO, and the sort of a career mixing is not very prominent. Whereas if you're under 40, the sort of career mixing becomes very, very prominent, and the link between being more important or being seen as knowing well within the network increases with mobility. So there is something going on in global governance where young people are learning that if they move around between IOs and NGOs and foundations and think tanks and corporations, that they can increase their chance of being powerful.
Yeah, if I could just jump in and amplify that point that Len just gave. Not only do I think that's empiric, not only do I think that sounds intuitive, but from the sort of personal data I can present from my own experience mentoring and dealing with undergraduate and graduate students over the past decade, I just find that that's empirically true in my perspective. I think I think we've long passed the point where younger, career-oriented entrants to what we call the global managerial class understand that careers in this community, this organizational community, whether transposed onto ROs or international financial institutions or other echelons of this sort of episteme, I think we've long passed the point where younger aspirants realize that careers are sticky. So they're not only path dependent, but they're sticky insofar that one point of contact or exposure to these networks increases the possibility or the probability that you'll have another point of contact or exposure with other organizations in the same network, particularly as you bounce around between lateral transfers in your office or you look for new careers, and your references tend to reproduce themselves as well, as you embark upon your, as you search for higher administrative or managerial or technocratic roles in these organizations. And it's very common for me these days to write letters of reference to people I've mentored, undergraduates or graduate students looking to break into one of these large NGOs or regional organizations, many of them based in Western cities, with the understanding that they want to be career global organizational people, which is not something that it's not something that I think we would have seen just even half a generation ago. But I'm now dealing with, a young aspirational class, for instance, in my work, where they realize, well, if I work for, if I get some low-level position in, say, this one development agency, or say in the crisis group, or in some outlying UN office, or at an entry-level analytical position at the bank, at the World Bank, then I know I can stay in that community and move up and just stay there for the duration. And there's an understanding there that stickiness is one of the defining qualities of an organizational career. And that to me has just been mind-blowing. I mean, for young people to recognize that and to use that to plan their lives around. I mean, it's depressing, but it's also very insightful.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Building on what Sean just said, I was wondering I have a question, what the future plans are, or what the immediate next steps are for the database, because, are you thinking of going wider, or are you thinking of going deeper? Because I was just thinking through this conversation about career paths and circulations and so on, that the leadership sometimes doesn't tell you what the organization is doing, right? The leadership often is the political face, and very important because they are the political face. But then as you go deeper into an organization, you might see a very different configuration of staff in terms of nationality and gender and education and all sorts of things. So I just think it would be interesting to be able to go sort of deeper, or take a sample and go deeper as well as wider.
I'll just say that's a nice idea. I mean, there's been discussion between various parties about both widening the number of IOs, keeping it current to 2023, but also generating other kinds of variables, both at the level of the IO and at the level of the individual. But yes, your idea of like maybe the prime leader is not the relevant unit is pretty salient. We could actually know something about the selection of the leaders if we know layers underneath them, right? So for example, like if the board or all the managerial staff are more prestige educated, global prestige educated than the leader, then that suggests that the leader was not selected because of that trait, right? So it also tells you information about the leader. So I guess that could be handled through sampling a bunch of IOs where we know we could get at that population. And Len suggested all this amazing work that him and Kente Kalenis does on the IMF. I have another question for you, Sateni. So if you were going to expand these data to get at these career, these sort of revolving door like sort of career pathways, how would you start doing that? Would you sample individuals within the data set, like irrespective of time, and do it? Or would there be a more refined selection procedure of, because you could find out someone's career history, where they went, when, and when they garner different attachments. Does anyone have any clever ideas?
I mean, I know some researchers are using LinkedIn to look at, I know one researcher who's looking at sort of technocrats working in environmental organizations, and he has found LinkedIn as a really useful, so that you don't have to go the path of interviews and so on, which is very they're both labor intensive, but there's the issue of access and whether you want to have people to interview them and so on. So I think those kinds of platforms might, I would take a sample from each of your three types of organizations and just try it out and see if the patterns that are showing themselves. Is that helpful, or is that obvious? I don't know.
I think to follow up on that, and there's one more question related to the meritocracy and equality of opportunities in selecting these leaders. I think one thing that we are not addressing, but hope that future research perhaps look in other databases, is the election process themselves. Like there are sometimes structural reasons why certain leaders are chosen, which is the case in World Bank and IMF, right? Since 45, we know that World Bank will always have an American. It's not written anywhere, but we know it will be an American, and IMF will have a European leader. Now, in some other organizations, there might be similar structures, written or unwritten. Are they contested or uncontested would be interesting, for example. Like when these leaders are chosen, was there a pool of candidates? and then this was chosen, or it was just single candidates, and what merits were considered in choosing them, so that we can address by looking at their backgrounds, perhaps, and education, and if that fits, like if you are leading the World Bank and have no economics or development background, which happened in Paul Wolfowitz's case, right? The year when World Bank was targeting anti-corruption programs in developing countries, and it turned out that the very first thing Wolfowitz did was to give a pay raise to his significant other, who was an economist apparently at the bank, or Strauss-Hahn when he was leading the IMF and then ended up getting detained on multiple charges, right, in France. So like but he was an economist at the same time and qualified perhaps on the economics ground. Like what extent merit actually plays a role, and that we can capture with economic and other foundations of the country level, but at the individual level, perhaps we may have to go in depth as well as we develop. And we are planning to update this data set, right, Kevin, and going forward, and Security in Context is highly committed to expand this data set in future years. And some ask us in the questions, we'll make the data available to the public in the coming months, from Security in Context and also the ACSS websites and Dataverse. But there are many questions that can be expanded, and perhaps other scholars can contribute to the ongoing debates on this leadership, multipolarity, great power conflict, competition, and influence. Like, to me, think maybe when finalizing the discussion also, the interesting part was how little influence Global South and emerging South countries had in this organizational leadership positions. Like with all the rhetoric and fear of rise of China in the West, for example, there's nothing substantial that we can speak of, neither on the Chinese national side nor Chinese universities, in terms of leadership in this large segments of organizations. And it really doesn't matter whether you are looking at public, civil, intergovernmental, or otherwise organizations. And we are talking about the second largest economy in the world, and the most populous country, the same with India, if you add them up, and we hardly see them in the leadership positions. So based on what Sean was saying, like the career paths of undergrads or young people going into this, there are also rigidities. To me, it looks like it really doesn't matter how qualified you are, unless you are from a certain university or from a certain nationality. In a kind of similar sense, in labor economics literature, there's the influence of the name, right? We know that there's significant labor market discrimination based on whether your name is a foreign-sounding name or not, and we find this in every single study in the US and Western Europe and North America, Canada included, and looks like a similar path dependence with nationality and university background regarding international organizations. So I think we are over time. If anybody has a final word, now is the time. Anybody to add?
On that final point, I mean, actually, sort of, I thought I saw on the front cover of the Lancet in March this year, there was sort of a calling out of the World Bank as being neo-colonial. So I think there is actually sort of, the sort of media pressure. If the Lancet, which is obviously based in medicine, is thinking about these things, and the front cover of the Lancet is about IO leadership. You're sort of calling out the World Bank as being neo-colonial. That to me also shows us that there is sort of strong pressure in terms of sort of a challenge to our current norms about having an American for the World Bank and a European for the IMF, or similar. So I think there is actually sort of a lot of pressure out there to reform the system, which is a great thing.
All right, then we'll finalize our webinar there. Thank you all for joining the discussion.